and to be governed by the majority and by a system of laws, human laws. But those human laws are only legitimate if they respect our natural rights, if they respect our unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. No parliament, no legislature, however democratic its credentials, can legitimately violate our natural rights. This idea that no law can violate our right to life, liberty, and property would seem to support the idea of a government so limited that it would gladden the heart of the libertarian after all. But those hearts should not be so quickly gladdened, because even though for Locke the law of nature persists once government arrives, even though Locke insists on limited government, government limited by the end for which it was created, namely the preservation of property, even so, there's an important sense in which what counts as my property, what counts as respecting my life and liberty, are for the government to define. That there be property, that there be respect for life and liberty is what limits government. But what counts as respecting my life and respecting my property, that is for governments to decide and to define. How can that be? Is Locke contradicting himself? Or is there an important distinction here? In order to answer that question, which will decide Locke's fit with the libertarian view, we need to look closely at what legitimate government looks like for Locke, and we turn to that next time. Nikolai, if you didn't think you'd get caught, would you pay your taxes?
I don't think so. I would rather have a system personally that I could give money to exactly those sections of the government that I support and not just blanket support everything.
You'd rather be in the state of nature, at least exactly. On April 15th. Last time, we began to discuss Locke's state of nature, his account of private property, his theory of legitimate government, which is government based on consent and also limited government. Locke believes in certain fundamental rights that constrain what government can do, and he believes that those rights are natural rights, not rights that flow from law or from government. And so Locke's great philosophical experiment is to see if he can give an account of how there could be a right to private property without consent before government and legislators arrive on the scene to define property. That's his question. That's his claim. There is a way, Locke argues, to create property, not just in the things we gather and hunt, but in the land itself, provided there is enough and is good left for others. Today I want to turn to the question of consent, which is Locke's second big idea. Private property is one, consent is the other. What is the work of consent? People here have been invoking the idea of consent since we began, since the first week You remember when we were talking about pushing the fat man off the bridge, someone said, but he didn't agree to sacrifice himself. It would be different if he consented. Or when we were talking about the cabin boy, killing and eating the cabin boy, some people said, well, if they had consented to a lottery, it would be different. Then it would be all right. So consent has come up a lot. And here in John Locke, we have one of the great philosophers of consent. Consent is an obvious, familiar idea in moral and political philosophy. Locke says that legitimate government is government founded on consent, and who nowadays would disagree with him? Sometimes when the ideas of political philosophers are as familiar as Locke's ideas about consent, it's hard to make sense of them, or at least to find them very interesting. But there are some puzzles, some strange features of Locke's account of consent as the basis of legitimate government. And that's what I'd like to take up today. One way of testing the plausibility of Locke's idea of consent, and also of probing some of its perplexities, is to ask just what a legitimate government founded on consent can do. What are its powers according to Locke? Well, in order to answer that question, it helps to remember what the state of nature is like. Remember, the state of nature is the condition that we decide to leave, and that's what gives rise to consent. Why not stay there? Why bother with government at all? Well, what's Locke's answer to that question? He says there are some inconveniences in the state of nature, but what are those inconveniences? The main inconvenience is that everyone can enforce the law of nature. Everyone is an enforcer, or what Locke calls the executor